Gene, 12 TPP parties represent big government procurement markets, lots of commercial opportunity. How did we do?
What's interesting about the government procurement chapter is that it's really not that new, because the U.S. already has procurement obligations with 8 of the other TPP parties. So the really focus is on Malaysia, Vietnam, and Brunei. Now, in procurement, just to give you a quick overview, there's two things you look for in procurement agreements. One is, what are the rules that apply to the procurement that's being covered by the agreement? And secondly is, what procurement are the countries covering? Because no country opens up all their procurement. And even the U.S. keeps a significant amount of its procurement sort of tucked away for its own suppliers. Now, in this agreement, as I mentioned, so 8 of the 12 parties, or 11 other parties, already have agreements with the U.S. The text is modeled after the WTO procurement agreement and other free trade agreements. So what the TPP procurement chapter does is basically brings the procurement standards, or the procurement parties, up to the standards of the other agreements. So in a sense, the TPP chapter represents the sort of current high standard for procurement coverage. But there are some differences in this agreement from other agreements. It's not quite as robust in some areas. There's some places where in other FTAs we basically had sort of uniform procurement obligations across the board. The TPP, not quite so much. I think what's happened for the parties who are currently covered by agreements is they basically incorporated their current obligations, and some made a few tweaks to what they covered and some didn't make any changes at all. So you look at that, so for the 9 parties, let me go to that slide. For the countries that we already have agreements with, we basically just incorporated those countries and their coverage into the TPP. So in that sense, it's just brings everyone up to the same standard. Mexico is the only one that had to make a bit of a stretch because NAFTA does not have sort of the state-of-the-art procurement procedures, and now Mexico will be bound by those. But the current, as I mentioned, there's some differences between coverage. One of the interesting points on this one is substantial coverage, because not all parties are covering their substantial entities. And the U.S. is one that has chosen not to do so at this point. But let me focus actually at this point on where I think the TPP really makes a difference, and that is for Malaysia and Vietnam, who are opening their procurement up for the first time under any trade agreement. And when a country opens its procurement for the first time, that's a really tough step. And I think particularly for Malaysia, go to Malaysia first. We tried to negotiate with Malaysia a free trade agreement several years ago. And one of the stumbling blocks was government procurement. And the issue was, how are they going to handle their preferences for their Bumi Putra? And their Bumi Putra are their ethnic Malays that comprise the majority of the population. And so they had a policy of basically giving preferences to all of their majority Malays. And the question was, how could they open up that procurement in a way that was not going to be disruptive domestically, and yet at the same time satisfy the U.S. interest in having access to their procurement market. So what they have done in the TPP, which I think has been a good step, is they found a way to basically balance Malaysia's concerns for protecting its domestic majority, if you will, and yet opening up some of their procurement. Now, clearly, this is not going to be an immediate, quick access to lots of procurement in Malaysia, but it's a first step. And I think one of the things the TPP is doing now, the TPP procurement chapter, is it's setting a new standard for how parties or countries negotiate with developing countries and provide them with some means of opening up their procurement that's going to facilitate their opening it up. And so this is setting a new standard. Because the TPP has transitional measures and special measures for Vietnam and Malaysia that go way beyond anything we've had in other agreements. So I think this will become the new standard. And hopefully it will become a positive standard and not one that everyone takes advantage of. So let me just go through quickly some of the provisions that Malaysia was given. They can set aside forever 30% of their construction contracts for their local suppliers. They can give price preferences to their Bumi Putra for a period of time, and the range of the preferences varies. They also were given higher transitional measures. Some transitional measures, particularly higher thresholds. One of the determinants of whether procurement is covered is whether it's above a certain monetary value. Now, both Malaysia and Vietnam were given very high transitional thresholds, which means that they can start at a very high level and say, basically, not such good access for the other TPP parties, but at least they're starting in some direction. So depending on the entities and what's being purchased, Malaysia has either temporary thresholds for 7 to 20 years. So it's going to be, the U.S. is going to be getting access to that in sort of a limited way over a period of time. They've also taken an exclusion for economic stimulus packages, which and they're getting that for 25 years. And that would be as if the U.S. when we had the 2009 Recovery Act and we had the stimulus package, if we just said, okay, anything under that package is simply off the table. So Malaysia's been given this what could be a fairly broad exclusion. They're also given offsets for 12 years, and they're able to delay some of the implementation for a period of time. Now, offsets are an issue that have been often, there's a prohibition in the agreement for offsets. So you can only have an offset if you've been permitted to do so. And currently, the only country that has broad offsets is Israel under the WTO government procurement agreement. So, in a sense, I think the Dominican Republic has some small offsets in there, in the CAFTA. But basically, the U.S. has been opposed to offsets. But they have come back in sort of full range in this agreement, both the 12 years for Malaysia, but especially for Vietnam. And so let me look, actually, go back that way. Okay, so Vietnam. So they've been given offsets for 25 years. And their offsets will be for the first 40 years, they can basically require in 40% of their procurement, they can impose offsets. Now, offsets are things like you can require domestic content, you can say you have to use domestic suppliers, you have to buy products made in Vietnam, you may have to invest or invest in technology. And what they've done, in most offsets, it's 40% of the value of the contract. The Vietnam offset provision says they can require offsets in 40% of their covered procurement. Not quite clear how this is going to work, but that's how it's been structured. And then 30% for the next 15 years. So this is clearly the broadest we've seen in terms of offsets, with the exception of Israel, which has had them for a very long time, but is now, under the WTO agreement, phasing them out and will terminate them eventually. Vietnam also is setting aside completely its pharmaceutical products 100% in the first 3 years of the TPP, which means they don't have to open up any of their pharmaceutical procurement for the first 3 years. And then it goes down to 60% from in the next 5 years and then on down. So that's one of the special measures that they were given. As I mentioned with Malaysia, they have very high thresholds, and they also both are allowed to delay implementation of some of their provisions. And this is a means of saying, okay, you're not quite ready to implement the whole agreement from the beginning. We'll let you have special time for some additional time to implement certain provisions. For instance, they can only require 25 days for bidding as opposed to the 40 days of the requirement as the bidding period for a period of time. And they also can delay implementing the requirement that they have an impartial bid authority. So these are special measures that have been given to them.